Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because this truly feels like a pivotal inflection point for Bitcoin here. We have not one, but two major catalysts happening next week. We have the Bitcoin 2024 conference with its insane lineup of guest speakers and of course a rumor that's been spreading around like wildfire. And of course we have the Ethereum spot ETFs going live, which has been confirmed by the CBOE. They'll be going live July 23rd on Tuesday. And when you combine two short-term narratives like those, you end up with a very bullish short-term price action where we saw that bearish breakdown from our 3-month trading range, and then we were able to reclaim it on a weekly closing basis, which means we have to be cautiously optimistic in the short term because of this price action. But on the other side of the coin, we're seeing a lot of macro uncertainty starting to pick up here, with Biden being sick and it becoming very likely he's going to step down, and the market has no idea who the replacement is going to be. And of course, we always talk about how markets hate uncertainty. And we also got some concerning economic data with the initial jobless claims print we got this week, which came in well above expectations at 243,000, a number that we really haven't seen many prints above over the past 2 years. And we know that's a leading indicator for our unemployment rate, which we've been saying for months now has gotten above its 2-year moving average, a signal that usually is a pretty concerning sign because this data print likes to pick up momentum once it gets above that 2-year moving average, like we saw in the 90s, which resulted in recession, like we saw in the dot-com bubble, which resulted in recession, and the great financial crisis, and in 2020. But of course, that one was expedited due to a black swan. But what do we see today? A slow and steady grind up in the unemployment rate, with it being above its 2-year moving average and it starting to pick up its momentum. And when you combine concerning labor market data with a lot of uncertainty surrounding the election, you end up with one of the most bearish weekly candles on the S&P 500 we've seen in months. And that's why this moment for Bitcoin is so crucial if the bulls are going to be right and we're really going to enter a blow off top rally here, because Biden is going to declare that Bitcoin is a strategic reserve asset for the United States at the conference, or we end up seeing some absurdly large inflows into these Ethereum ETFs. Two outcomes that I think are very unlikely, but if those were to occur, we likely enter that crazy rally everybody is hoping and praying for. But if we do see this uncertainty surrounding the election pickup and we continue to see economic weakness and we see a larger correction in the short term in traditional markets, then it's a lot more likely Bitcoin spends more time consolidating and we stick more to that normal cycle scenario where we consolidate into Q3, maybe start to pick up our rally in Q4, and then the real party starts in Q1 or Q2 of 2025. And you can call me a permabear or say it's PTSD, but every single time I have seen a rumor like this one since I joined the space in 2017, everybody ended up getting excited going into the event with the anticipation that this magical thing was going to happen, but it ended up not occurring or ended up being underwhelming, and the market ended up having a sell-off. And for those of you that are around for a long time, I'm sure you're going to remember a lot of these events. For example, I vividly remember April of 2021, and I'm not calling a macro top here. I'm not saying we're entering a bear market, but I remember April 2021 when everybody was excited that Elon Musk was going to go on Saturday Night Live and he was going to pump our bags so we could sell at significantly higher prices, and he was going to send Dogecoin to $1. He was going to send Bitcoin to 100K. But everybody already knew this was coming and had already positioned for it in advance. So when he went on SNL and did essentially nothing, markets sold off aggressively. I also remember very vividly over here in September of 2021, where there was a rumor circulating that Apple was going to put Bitcoin on its balance sheet and it was going to follow in the footsteps of Tesla and MicroStrategy. And it was spreading like wildfire all over Twitter with the exact same accounts that are spreading this rumor. And then it ended up being not even close to happening whatsoever, and everybody forgot about it. And of course, my favorite one was November 2021, when El Salvador put Bitcoin on its balance sheet, And the rumor at the time was this is just the beginning. We're in talks with all of these other South American countries. We already have 3 or 4 lined up that are going to be doing the same. This is the beginning of the super cycle. This is how Bitcoin becomes a world reserve currency. All these South American countries are going to follow El Salvador. But of course, it ended up not happening. So I would love to be surprised, and I would love it if this actually ended up happening. But the likelihood of the leading presidential candidate to come out and announce Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset and an alternative to the dollar, which of course the US and the Federal Reserve manage and control as the world reserve currency, why would they ever do something like this for Bitcoin to this degree when it goes directly against the dollar? So would love to get your guys' thoughts. That might frustrate some people because everything I'm seeing on Twitter is just people celebrating this and saying, do you have Bitcoin? Are you all in? Imagine selling your Bitcoin before this happens. So anyway, let me know what you think about this one. Definitely one of the craziest rumors we've had in a while. And I think the conference is going to end up being underwhelming because we've built up this rumor to such a large degree that if we see anything less than this, markets are probably going to be greatly disappointed because the expectations are already so high. And I view the Ethereum ETF somewhat similarly. I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as high demand as the Bitcoin one. One, because I'm sure institutions would love to buy and hold their own Ethereum and stake it and get that 3% yield. So giving up that yield by buying the ETFs isn't that appealing in my opinion. So I don't think it's going to see as much demand. And of course, Ethereum doesn't have the brand awareness that Bitcoin does. So we'll see what happens with the ETF. I'm cautiously optimistic. Same thing with the conference. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I would love to see prices do well and go higher, and for us to see that blow off top move that a successful conference and a successful Ethereum ETF launch would result in. But I still think the normal cycle is way more likely because I think these two events are incredibly overhyped. And of course, the normal cycle thesis also agrees nicely with what we're seeing with the S&P 500. And this bearish engulfing candle isn't something we see often. And for those of you that don't know, bearish engulfing candles just means the weekly candle traded above the previous week's highest price, but then closed below the low of the previous week. So we went above last week's high, but closed below last week's low. And these are pretty rare for the S&P 500. I mean, the most obvious one that I see is back over here in January of 2022. And I'm not saying anything anywhere near that is what's going to happen now, but just pretty interesting. And we also see somewhat similar price action in our last two corrections. We had an almost bearish engulfing candle there, but it didn't get quite above previous week's high. And then same thing in August of 2023. We didn't get quite above the previous week's high, but we did close right below or well below the previous week's low. So we'll see what happens with that. But as of right now, it does look like a short-term correction is underway. And this is by no means S&P 500 specific. We can also look at the NASDAQ, very huge sell-off this week and undoing that very large green candle we had 2 weeks ago. And then with the Dow Jones, you have this huge wick to the upside. We had a higher high, higher low, higher high, higher low, and then a pretty substantial higher high, but then sellers stepped in quite aggressively. And this reminds me of a price action that we saw a couple years ago for Bitcoin, where we had that high, higher low, higher high, higher low, huge wick to the upside, and then a sell-off. Of course, this isn't the exact same, but it is interesting to see how much sellers have stepped in. And of course, we're going to have to see if there's continuation. But right now, a lot of people are watching what's happening with the Russell 2000 and small caps. We saw the two huge moves to the upside and the breakout of this multi-year range, but we saw the sellers step in there as well. So it's definitely a very interesting point to see what's going to happen here for the S&P 500 and for small caps. And this bearish engulfing candle is definitely something I'm going to be watching, especially because Bitcoin was able to put in such a large rally and put in such a strong move while the S&P 500 was selling off, because it's not very common that we see this divergence. And usually Bitcoin can't ignore the S&P 500 correcting for that long. So this is definitely something to monitor going forward. Of course, Bitcoin is quite a ways from putting in a new high. So maybe if the S&P 500 does recover, that could help Bitcoin go higher. But as of right now, definitely something I'm watching very closely if we continue to see this weakness in the S&P 500. In terms of updating some general supply dynamics, we're still seeing those Mt. Gox repayments going on. Apparently 3 billion have been paid out already and there's 5.8 left to go, but this can be tricky because we don't know how quick they'll be able to sell that Bitcoin once it hits their accounts if they want to. But again, this isn't something that matters much in the long term. It's more of a short-term issue that once we get through that supply, we won't have to worry about it anymore. Same thing with the minor capitulation going on here. We're still waiting to see that recovery in the hash rate and see that green buy signal flash on the hash ribbons, but we haven't seen that recovery quite yet. But these higher prices should definitely be helping the Bitcoin miners as of right now. And of course, a lot of this is what we expected. This is just how Bitcoin summers go. Sentiment flipping back and forth, sharp drops, sharp bounces, wrecking leverage traders in both directions. And this is why I'm trying to keep my expectations relatively muted between now and September, even though we're seeing all of these narratives build up a lot of excitement and the ETFs are going live, but there's also a lot of fear surrounding the election and surrounding the S&P 500 having its correction and all of this supply from governments and Mt. Gox. All of this is just kind of standard summer price action for Bitcoin, and my main goal is not losing money and surviving until the summer is over, and then perhaps we can have that rally going into 2025 that starts in Q4 once the summer chop is behind us. And that's why my portfolio is set up the way it is. As you guys know, I mean, as I'm sure a lot of you know because you've been roasting me for it, I did take some profits over the past 2 weeks during this nice bounce in case this ends up being a local high here and we end up getting underwhelmed on this rumor being spread and we don't see a lot of demand for the ETFs. I just wanted to add a little bit to my cash position to be able to manage any type of volatility we end up seeing. And maybe we do end up going higher and I get to ride the other 72% to higher prices, but I wanted to shore up my cash reserves a little bit in case we end up seeing some great opportunities later this summer. As for interest rates, consensus is still a rate cut in September and no rate cut in July, which is pretty crazy because we're starting to see that economic weakness and September is still quite a ways away. And of course, we're going to see what the unemployment rate prints say between now and then. But for now, we still have inflation going down and the dollar index is trying to reclaim that breakdown level at 104. Next week should be really interesting because we're going to see if the dollar index is going to be able to reclaim that level and perhaps go higher, or if it's going to get rejected at resistance here and continue its breakdown. Of course, crypto bulls want to see that rollover because Bitcoin mania phases require those long downtrends in the dollar index. And of course, we haven't seen that retail interest come back to the space quite yet. We usually need to see quite a bit of money printing and currency devaluation to bring back that retail mania that we haven't seen for quite a while now. And that's also why we don't see that mania and that alt season until we see that devaluation in the currency and in the dollar index. As for Ethereum, pretty decent weekly candle as of right now. Would love to see it close above the 20-week moving average and above the mid-range going into this ETF. But of course, a lot of our questions are going to get answered next week when we see what those inflows end up looking like. We're also seeing some pretty impressive price action here from Solana as well as it tries to break out of this downtrend that it's been below for months and months. But of course, we'll wait for the weekly close and see how that goes. As for Bitcoin, I still think it's in a fair value range, but maybe we end up seeing it exit this fair value region and head into the overvalued territory if we are going to see that left translated cycle play out. But we'll have to see how that develops based on the catalysts we have next week. And in terms of how low Bitcoin can go, we got very close to our possible region in the low 50,000s. I'm still open to Bitcoin revisiting lower prices, but of course, a lot of that is going to rely on macro and what happens with the Bitcoin conference and Ethereum ETFs. And of course, in the long term, seeing all of this Bitcoin being taken in by these spot ETFs and taken off the market is likely going to put nice upward pressure on price in the longer term, which is why we remain bullish on this asset on larger time frames, just like we're bullish on the S&P 500 in the long term as well, because currency devaluation is the government's solution to all problems, and we don't see that trend going away anytime soon. The timing is of course difficult to know, but on a long enough time horizon, we have to be bullish on risk assets like stocks and Bitcoin because of that currency devaluation. But anyway, let me know what you expect. Is this rumor overhyped or is this actually going to happen for the first time ever in this space? And what do you expect for the cycle? Will it be a left translated cycle with a blow off top going into the end of the year, or will it be a normal cycle where we rally into Q1 and Q2 of 2025? Or are there some of you out there that think this is going to be a failed cycle where 74K was our top and we just grind down over the next 6 to 12 months? Would love to know what you expect. Thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.